Alright, Year 12, this is your analysis video for the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Please make sure that you have read the entire poem for yourself before you watch this video. It's important that you get a sense of the whole poem before we go through it stanza by stanza in detail. So if you haven't done that yet, please just pause the video now, go away and do that, and then come back and watch the rest of the video. As you're watching, make sure that you have your Module B booklet in front of you and that you're annotating your poem as you go. Make sure that you pause the video to note down any questions that you have and things like that. And please also don't just pause the video and copy down my annotations. Actually listen to what I'm saying. I will add other things that are not on the slides and I will explain the annotations. So make sure that you're listening and also taking note of what I'm saying, not just what's written on the slides. Eliot's poetry is very dense and there's a lot that we could talk about. There's no way that I could mention everything that I'd like to in a video like this. So it's very likely that you will notice things in the poem that I haven't mentioned. That's really good. Make sure that you take a note of those things. Take a note of lines that you find really interesting, lines that you don't understand, that you can bring to your class to discuss. Remember that Module B is all about your personal perspective and engagement with the text. So really be thinking about what you think, your own opinion, as we go through the poem. All right, so Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock is one of Eliot's earlier poems. It was written in 1915. Some of the main ideas that we're going to see come up in this poem are ideas around frustration and the impotence of the modern man. So if you don't know that word impotence, that is defined as the inability to take effective action. It also has sexual connotations, so the inability to perform sexually. So we're going to explore issues about frustration, the inability to act as characteristics of the modern man. We're going to see that modern man be plagued by paralysis and physical and emotional inertia. So inertia is that idea of being unchanged or staying the same. So a sense of stagnation in the modern man as well. Disillusionment, alienation, isolation, the decay of the modern city, and a constant awareness of mortality are all going to be issues that come up, as well as issues around masculinity and kind of a crisis in masculinity that Prufrock is illustrating. So just take note of those ideas as we get to them. In terms of style and form, this is a variation on a dramatic monologue. That is the form that Eliot is writing in. So a dramatic monologue is the utterances of a persona directed at an implied listener, okay? So Eliot has created a character, which is J. Alfred Prufrock, and we can imagine that this is his monologue. So this is his speech directed at someone who he's talking to. And dramatic monologues usually reveal the thought processes and character of an individual. So that's what we can expect from this poem. It's written in free verse, which means there is no consistent rhyme pattern. There's no consistent amount of lines in each stanza or anything like that. Although there are some stylistic features like refrains and some moments of rhyme throughout. One of the other stylistic features that you will notice, not just in this poem, but across Eliot's suite of poetry, is fragmentation. So lots of things like interruptions, stanzas that don't seem to really connect to each other, juxtaposing images, all of this kind of fragmentary images and things like that that are going on throughout the poem. All right, moving on to the title. So you will notice as we move through the different poems that a feature of Eliot's poetry is that he often has an ironic title. So often the title of his poem will actually contrast with the content of the poem, and that's definitely the case for Love Song. Okay, the title, Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, makes us expect that we're about to read some kind of love poem, when really what we get is kind of the opposite, the inability of J. Alfred Prufrock to find love. There is also kind of a juxtaposition between the two parts of the title, Love Song and then J. Alfred Prufrock. I don't know about you, but to me, the name J. Alfred Prufrock sounds a little bit more like, I don't know, like an accountant than a grand lover. It's quite an unusual name. It doesn't seem very heroic. It's quite everyday. And so there's kind of this juxtaposition between Love Song and then of J. Alfred Prufrock. You will, if you do any research on this poem, you'll come across different interpretations of what this name means. Again, this unit is all about you coming up with your own opinion. So you can take these interpretations, you can say, yep, I think they're strong, or you can reject them. One that you'll find is that maybe Prufrock is kind of a play on words, kind of sounds like prude in a frock, okay, which suggests emasculation, which is one of the themes of the poem, that J. Alfred Prufrock is struggling with his masculinity, he's struggling with his sexual performance, those kinds of things. You can think that's a bit far-fetched, or you might think that's a good interpretation. Okay, if you look at your poem, you will notice that the first thing that we get is that little section in italics. That is the epigraph of the poem. Another feature of Eliot's poetry is often he uses epigraphs as a framing device. Now, I'm not going to read the Italian to you, and you can go and look up the direct translation if you're interested. What we need to know is that this is a quote taken from Dante's poem Inferno. Dante was an Italian poet, and this is a 14th century epic poem. The lines that we're given were spoken by the character Guido, I think is how you pronounce it, and he has been damned to the 8th circle of hell. So he's speaking these lines from within hell. The fact that Eliot has included this as the epigraph, as that framing device, suggests that there's some kind of parallel between the character of Guido and Prufrock. So some things that we can think about is that maybe they're both in hell. So maybe this epigraph is suggesting that Prufrock is speaking out of a situation of his own personal hell, which is the modern world. They're also both concerned about their reputation. So that's something that Guido, the character, is concerned about, and also Prufrock is concerned about. And they both, to some extent, are presenting a facade or a pretense. So those are some thoughts on the epigraph. Okay, now we'll get into the actual poem. So what I'll do is I'll kind of read it stanza by stanza and just point out a few notable features or ideas in the stanzas. Again, make sure that you're thinking about it for yourself as well and noting down anything that you notice. All right, so the first stanza of our poem. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels, and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells, streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent, to lead you to an overwhelming question. Oh, do not ask, what is it? Let us go and make our visit. So if we look just at that first image to start, we have a juxtaposition or a contrast between action with the imperative, let us go, then you and I, and an image of paralysis, which is the evening spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. So ether was an old-fashioned anesthetic. So this is an image of a person paralyzed upon a table. So we start with this tension between action and inaction, which is something that we're going to see develop across the poem. The next section kind of introduces our setting. So Prufrock is inviting someone, we don't know who it is yet, to take a walk with him through these urban streets. Now the adjective choices, which I've highlighted in purple, half deserted, muttering, restless, one night cheap hotels, and sawdust restaurants, are not painting a particularly nice image of the urban street. It's kind of undesirable, it's run down, it's kind of decaying. And there's this suggestion of like moral decay or something not very desirable happening. The one night cheap hotels, restless nights, okay? Streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent. We have the personification of the streets and then them being compared to a tedious argument. Again, it's this image of the streets as having bad intentions towards Prufrock. The city is a place of being trapped, and it's tedious, it's monotonous, okay? And then the end of that stanza to lead you to an overwhelming question, or do not ask, what is it? So that ellipsis, the 3 dots at the end of the overwhelming questions, kind of is suggesting this impending climax. We're going to find out what this overwhelming question is. But then the next line and the enjambment there creates a sense of interruption and delay, suggesting that Prufrock is pushing aside this overwhelming question. And this question is a motif that we're going to see come up again and again in the poem. We never really find out what this question is, but you can definitely have some interesting conversations with your peers about what you think it might be. Then we get this interesting 2 lines. In the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. This becomes a refrain in the poem, so it comes up a number of times. And it contributes to structural fragmentation, which means that it kind of interrupts the flow of the poem. It's a bit random. We're taking a walk through a street and then suddenly he's talking about women coming and going in a room. We don't know where the room is. It's kind of this interruption to the flow. Now again, the reference to Michelangelo, you will hear different people say different things about its significance. I'm just going to mention a couple of interpretations. So it could be indicating kind of a criticism of the superficial pseudo-intellectualism of the women who represent modern individuals. They're kind of talking about Michelangelo, talking about these intellectual things, but maybe they don't really know what they mean. The other interpretation, which I kind of like, is that Michelangelo is a reference to kind of ideal masculinity. So if we think about who Michelangelo was, he was highly influential. He was the archetypal Renaissance man that kind of was an expert in many fields. One of his most famous works was the Statue of David, which is kind of this portrait of ideal masculinity. And so maybe Prufrock is, he's concerned that he doesn't live up to this image of the ideal man. So the women are coming and going, talking about this ideal man, and Prufrock is listening and wondering, does he measure up or not? Okay. The yellow fog that rubs its back upon the window panes, the yellow smoke that rubs its muzzle on the window panes, licked its tongue into the corners of the evening. lingered upon the pools that stand in drains, let fall upon its back the soot that falls from chimneys, slipped by the terrace, made a sudden leap, and seeing that it was a soft October night, curled once about the house and fell asleep. So here we've got this extended feline metaphor where the fog and the smoke is kind of being described as a cat. Again, we have images of decay in the city, so the fog, the drains, the soot, some more kind of sexualized images, the licking of the tongue, things like that. And it's quite somnolent, okay, which means kind of lazy, or there's not much action happening. The cat is dormant, he falls asleep in the end, and that's personifying the urban environment as being this place of kind of laziness and inaction. And indeed, there will be time for the yellow smoke that slides along the street, rubbing its back upon the window panes. There will be time to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet. There will be time to murder and create, and time for all the works and days of hands that lift and drop a question on your plate. Time for you and time for me, and time yet for 100 indecisions and for 100 visions and revisions before the taking of a toast and tea. So in this section, we kind of move to more introspection. So now we're getting into Prufrock's thought processes. And the first thing that we see him obsessing over is the passage of time, okay? Time and aging and action, okay? So this whole section is a biblical allusion to Ecclesiastes 3, which is that section of the Bible that talks about the fact that there is time for everything. There's time to murder, time to create, time to sow, time to reap, all of these things. Now, this is quite ironic in this section of the poem, because even though Prufrock is saying that he has time to do all these things, he doesn't actually end up doing anything. So he kind of uses this idea of having time as an excuse to not act. The other thing that we get introduced to in this section is his concern about the judgment of others, and a suggestion that he feels he needs to socially perform. He needs to prepare a face, construct a facade in order to engage socially with people, and he's very concerned about that. At the end of this stanza, we have this juxtaposition that again keeps coming up throughout the poem between things that are significant and things that are everyday, okay? 100 visions and revisions before the taking of a toast and tea. So 100 decisions, 100 visions, quite significant things, this overwhelming question that he has, juxtaposed with having some toast and tea. And the suggestion, what that juxtaposition is communicating is that Prufrock's search for purpose and meaning, his search for what the overwhelming question, these big questions that he has, is constantly interrupted by the mundane routines of modern life. And this was a concern that Eliot had, that modern man was kind of vacuous and empty because they were caught up in just these monotonous everyday routines, which prevented them from being concerned with things that actually mattered. And then we get the refrain again, in the room the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. And again, it's contributing to that structural fragmentation. It's interrupting Prufrock's train of thought. And indeed, there will be time to wonder, do I dare and do I dare? Time to turn back and descend the stair with a bald spot in the middle of my hair. They will say, how his hair is growing thin. My morning coat, my collar mounting firmly to the chin, my necktie rich and modest, but asserted by a single pin. They will say, but how his arms and legs are thin. Do I dare disturb the universe? In a minute there is time for decisions and revisions, which a minute will reverse. Okay, so we get more of these rhetorical questions here. Do I dare? Do I dare? Do I dare disturb the universe? And this is really suggesting that Prufrock does have a desire to find meaning. He has questions. He has, that desire to search for knowledge and to ask really big existential questions. I don't think it's really clear what he means when he says, do I dare disturb the universe? Now would be a good time to think about what you think about that, and maybe take a note to discuss with your class. What does he actually mean by do I dare disturb the universe? We also get, again, Prufrock being plagued by insecurities about how others are viewing him, particularly in a superficial sense. So particularly in terms of his aging physical appearance. So he's concerned about his bald spot. He's concerned that he's getting thin and old, and that people are noticing that and judging him. The use of the parenthesis here is illustrating his imagining of what other people are thinking about him. And these thoughts are kind of obsessions for him. In a minute, there is time for decisions and revisions, which a minute will reverse. Again, quite an ironic statement. There is time to make a decision, but as soon as a minute passes, that decision will be unmade. So no progress is kind of actually being made, even though time is passing. For I have known them all already, known them all, have known the evenings, mornings, afternoons. I have measured out my life with coffee spoons. I know the voices dying with a dying fall, beneath the music from a farther room. So how should I presume? So we get this sense of the monotonous routine of life. He says he has known evenings and mornings and afternoon, and he knows them all. They are all the same. He can't escape them. And they define his life. So we have that very famous metaphor, I've measured out my life with coffee spoons. And that's kind of suggesting that the sum of his life is trivial, okay? The meaning of his life is just defined by everyday matters, like having a cup of coffee, okay? And the coffee that he has every day. Now this next bit, I know the voices dying with a dying fall beneath the music from a farther room. It's kind of symbolizing Prufrock's social exclusion. So he's outside the room, he can hear the music that's going on within the room, but he's not included. Again, his anxieties about forming relationships and being understood and being judged is clear here. And I've known the eyes already, known them all, the eyes that fix you in a formulated phrase. And when I'm formulated, sprawling on a pin, when I'm pinned and wriggling on the wall, then how should I begin to spit out all the buttons of my days and ways? And how should I presume? So another stylistic feature of Eliot's poetry that you will notice not just in this poem but across the suite is synecdoche. So synecdoche is when a part is used to represent the whole. So in this case, the eyes, the part of the person, is used as a stand-in for the whole. And when Eliot uses this, it's really this sense of people being fragmented, okay? So they're just their eyes. There's a lack of social connection. Eliot is not seeing people as a whole being, they're just kind of eyes. So people are being fragmented in the modern world. Then he uses this metaphor, kind of comparing himself to a bug that's been kind of pinned on the wall and is now being observed, if you can imagine that, and studied, if you can imagine that image. So again, feeding into his obsession with being constantly observed and examined. And then he also compares his life to kind of a discarded cigarette butt. So he doesn't think his life is worthwhile. And he uses all these as kind of constant excuses not to act. And I've known the arms already, known them all. Arms that are braceleted and white and bare, but in the lamplight downed with light brown hair. Is it perfume from a dress that makes me so digress? Arms that lie upon a table or wrap around a shawl. And how should I then presume? And how should I begin? All right, so now he's kind of talking about the fact that he has known, well, first we've got synecdoche again, because he's describing the women here as just being arms. He's known the arms already. So again, people are being fragmented. They're not whole. And it's kind of this image of like meaningless sexual encounters. He's saying he's known all of these people, but there doesn't seem to be much connection happening. And he gets distracted in the middle by perfume from the woman's dress. So again, maybe some suggestions of impotence, that he's unable to sexually perform as well. Shall I say I've gone at dusk through narrow streets and watched the smoke that rises from the pipes of lonely men in shirt sleeves leaning out of windows. I should have been a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floor of silent seas. So we get quite, again, a juxtaposition of seemingly disconnected images here. We go from the women to then these men leaning out of windows to then this image of the crab. And these kind of really, it represents the chaos of Prufrock's mind. He's jumping from thing to thing. He can't seem to follow anything to its conclusion. And obviously we've got this pretty sad image of him saying that he would have been better off being a crab, and not even just a crab, it's just a pair of claws. And then just think about the adjective choice, ragged claws, and the verb choice of scuttling. Again, he doesn't have a very high opinion of himself. And the afternoon, the evening, sleeps so peacefully, smoothed by long fingers, asleep, tired, or it malingers, stretched on the floor here beside you and me. Should I, after tea and cakes and ices, have the strength to force the moment to its crisis? But though I've wept and fasted, wept and prayed, though I've seen my head, grown slightly bald, brought in upon a platter, I'm no prophet, and there's no great matter. I've seen the moment of my greatness flicker. I've seen the eternal footman hold my coat and snicker. And in short, I was afraid. So we start here with more of that somnolent imagery, okay? Sleeping, lazy, tired. The evening is asleep. And we do have this kind of mirroring of the physical environment and Prufrock as a person, okay? So how his physical urban environment is also reflecting his mental state. Should I, after tea and cakes and ices, have the strength to force the moment to its crisis? Again, we can talk about what exactly he's trying to do. Forcing the moment to its crisis obviously has sexual connotations, or maybe is this about him finally asking the overwhelming question that he's been trying to ask the whole time? Again, we don't know, it's ambiguous, but you can have your own interpretation as long as it's consistent with the rest of the poem. Then we get a biblical allusion to John the Baptist. So if you remember from the Bible, John the Baptist was a prophet before Jesus, and he was beheaded, and his head was brought in on a platter. So Prufrock kind of imagines himself as John the Baptist, but it's a bit ironic that, you know, he's been beheaded, and yet he's concerned about the fact that, well, his beheaded head is bald. So he says that. But then we got this declarative statement that he's no prophet and he's no great matter, okay? So he doesn't have a prophet is someone who speaks the truth and speaks knowledge and understanding. Prufrock saying he's not like that. And then we kind of get to one of his main concerns, which he's concerned about dying. He's concerned that the eternal footman is going to come. So that's an image of death coming to get him. And we see here that in his imagination, death is snickering at him. Okay, so quite an unpleasant image of death coming to get him, and that being, he's running out of time because he has this constant impression that the moment of his greatness is flickering, and that's something that he's afraid of. This line, in short, I was afraid, is really a turning point in the poem, because to me, I think this is getting to the heart of what is wrong with Prufrock. And it's something that's been in his subconscious the whole time. Would it have been worth it, after all, after the cups, the marmalade, the tea, among the porcelain, among the talk of you and me? Would it have been worthwhile to have bitten off the matter with a smile, to have squeezed the universe into a ball, to roll it towards some overwhelming question, to say, I'm Lazarus, come from the dead, come back to tell you all, I shall tell you all. If one settling a pillow by her head should say, that is not what I meant at all, that is not it at all. Sorry about that typo there. So he's saying kind of, would forcing the moment to the crisis, actually saying what he means, all of those things, would it have been worth it after all of these everyday things? So we get this accumulation of everyday objects that have been crowding out his life, okay, that have been preventing him from the search for meaning. We get this ambiguous metaphor of him squeezing the universe into a ball and rolling it towards some overwhelming question. Again, I think that you can have a discussion about what you think that metaphor is actually saying. It's something about finding meaning in the universe, I think. Another biblical allusion, so now he's comparing himself to Lazarus. Remember, Lazarus was Jesus's friend who Jesus resurrected. And so he has this moment of him saying, what if I'm Lazarus? What if I come back and deliver this profound message? But then that's immediately juxtaposed, or we get this letdown when the person he's talking to doesn't seem to understand him. There's a concern about his inability to communicate anything to anyone he's in a relationship with. Would it be worth it after all? Would it have been worthwhile after the sunsets and the dooryards and the sprinkled streets, after the novels, after the teacups, after the skirts that trail along the floor, and this and so much more? It is impossible to say just what I mean. But as if a magic lantern threw the nerves in patterns on a screen, would it have been worthwhile if one settling a pillow or throwing off a shawl and turning toward the window should say, that's not it at all. That's not what I meant at all. So again, quite similar to the previous stanza, we have this list of the everyday. We've got some anaphora, polysyndeton, trivial matters that are filling Prufrock's life. But then we get an even more kind of extreme version of what we saw in the previous paragraph with this very high modality statement where he says, it's impossible to say what I mean. Communication is actually impossible for Prufrock. We can't actually communicate with each other in any meaningful way. That's his concern. Obviously with the pillow and throwing off the shawl, quite feminine images there. And I think he's questioning whether the search for meaning in relationships, especially in relationships with women, is worth it when he knows that he can never fully communicate clearly with another person. No, I'm not Prince Hamlet, nor was meant to be. I'm an attendant lord, one that will do to swell a progress, start a scene or two, advise the prince, no doubt an easy tool. Deferential, glad to be of use, politic, cautious and meticulous, full of high sentence, but a bit obtuse. At times, indeed, almost ridiculous, almost at times the fool. So we get a Shakespearean allusion here to Hamlet. And what Prufrock is really saying here is that he is a background character in his own life, okay? He's not Prince Hamlet. He's not the star. He's not the protagonist, which again is pretty bleak because we should be the protagonist in our own life. We shouldn't be a background player, but he's saying that's who he is. And if we look at how he describes the attendant lord, it's kind of, you know, he's well-meaning, but he's insignificant. In fact, almost in the end of the stanza, almost ridiculous, almost a fool. I grow old, I shall wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled. Again, we get this fragmented structure, we get this interruption. He's having these extreme kind of epiphanies or insights into his life, and then that's interrupted. I grow old, I shall wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled. And it's again, what's he being interrupted by? These kinds of superficial thoughts about what other people think of him, and a concern with his own aging. And that's kind of the pattern that we see over and over again with the poem. He kind of gets to having almost an epiphany or a moment of insight, and then that is interrupted. All right, and the end. Shall I part my hair behind? Do I dare eat a peach? I shall wear white flannel trousers and walk upon the beach. I've heard the mermaids singing each to each. I don't think they will sing for me. I've seen them riding seaward on the waves, combing the white hair of the waves blown back, when the wind blows the water white and black. We have lingered in the chambers of the sea, by seagulls wreathed with seaweed red and brown, till human voices wake us and we drown. Okay, so this last section starts with Prufrock asking again some insignificant questions. Shall I part my hair behind? Do I dare eat a peach? So his questions have gone from existential, do I dare disturb the universe, to the like insignificant, trivial, everyday questions. Does he dare eat a peach? Okay, the contrast between the two do I dare questions is quite significant. And what we see here is that Prufrock has made no progress. There's been no movement forward. With the mermaids, this is an allusion to the mythology of sirens. So remember, sirens were kind of like mermaids who would, like attractive mermaids who would lure men, particularly sailors, to their death by singing to them. But Prufrock says even a siren whose job it is to lure men away, they won't sing for me. So again, an image of sexual impotence. And then the final stanza, this is quite an ambiguous ending. Lots of discussion about what this is really talking about or referring to. And ambiguous endings are another common stylistic feature of Eliot's poetry. He often ends with these kinds of like obtuse metaphors that are very unclear. So I would strongly encourage you to have a discussion with your classmates about what you think this ending is trying to communicate. A couple of things to think about. Do the chambers of the sea represent the human subconscious? And he's saying that we've lingered in my subconscious now long enough. Interesting to think about who the we are. Who is he talking about here? And then obviously we end in death with him drowning, okay? But yeah, have a conversation with your classmates about what you think about that ending. All right, I know that was a long one. That is by far the longest poem. So the other videos won't be as long as this. But thank you for sticking around to the end. I hope it was useful. Make sure that you finish off your annotations, think about what you think the poem means so that you have some good content to discuss when you go to class. Thank you guys.